There is a small town in northeastern Pennsylvania called Exeter. It sits in the Wyoming Valley, surrounded by the Appalachian Mountains, and for most of its history it has been defined by one thing: coal. The men of Exeter went into the mines. They descended into the earth before sunrise and came back up, blackened and exhausted after dark. The women of Exeter kept the homes, raised the children, and waited. That was the life. That was the expectation. That was the world into which Anne Agnes Bernatitus was born on January 21st, 1912. She was the daughter of immigrants, raised in a working-class household where money was never plentiful and ambition, especially in a woman, was considered an extravagance. The Wyoming Valley was not a place that encouraged girls to dream too large. The path laid out for them was narrow and familiar: school, marriage, motherhood, and if they were lucky, a life close to the people they loved. Anne Bernatitus saw that path. She simply chose a different one. She was a serious student, quiet, observant, methodical, the kind of girl who paid attention. She graduated from high school in 1928 at just 16 years old, an age when most of her classmates were still figuring out who they were. Anne already knew what she wanted, or at least she knew what she didn't want. She didn't want the mine. She didn't want the waiting. She wanted to be useful in a way that mattered. She decided to become a nurse. In 1931, she entered nursing training at the Wyoming Valley Homeopathic Hospital in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. The program was not gentle. It was 4 years of intensive study and clinical practice, of long shifts and difficult cases, of learning to hold yourself together when everything around you was falling apart. The training was designed to break the weak and forge the strong. Anne graduated in 1934. But the world she graduated into was the world of the Great Depression, a world where even capable, trained people couldn't find work. She pursued a postgraduate course in operating room technique at the University of Pennsylvania Graduate Hospital in Philadelphia, refining her surgical skills, making herself indispensable. She worked there as a staff nurse. She briefly moved to New Rochelle Hospital in New York, only to discover she needed New York State registration to continue. She returned to Pennsylvania and accepted a position at Canacao State Hospital near her hometown. It was a good job, a respectable job, a safe job. Anne Bernatitus was not interested in safe. She had read about the Navy Nurse Corps. Established in 1908, it was one of the few institutions in America that actively recruited women for service. Real service. Not secretarial work, not support roles, but nursing at the highest level, aboard ships and in military hospitals around the world. The Navy would take her somewhere. The Navy would give her purpose on a scale that Canacao State Hospital simply could not match. On September 25, 1936, at 24 years old, Anne Agnes Bernatitus was appointed ensign in the United States Navy Nurse Corps. She had left Exeter behind. The question now was how far she could go. Her first assignment was at the Naval Hospital in Chelsea, Massachusetts, a busy facility near Boston where she built her clinical foundation. In September 1937, she transferred to the Naval Hospital in Annapolis, Maryland. She spent 3 years there, mastering the craft of surgical nursing, becoming the kind of nurse that surgeons asked for by name. She was precise, steady, and unshakable in a crisis. Those qualities would serve her well in ways she couldn't yet imagine. In March 1940, she received orders for duty aboard the USS Chaumont, a transport ship. It was her first taste of life at sea, the rhythm of the ocean, the particular kind of camaraderie that forms among people who have nothing between them and deep water. Then, in July 1940, came the assignment that would change everything. She was ordered to the United States Naval Hospital at Canacao in the Philippine Islands. The Philippines in 1940 were, by almost any measure, one of the most beautiful places on earth. The islands stretched across 1,000 miles of the Pacific. Emerald mountains, white sand beaches, warm turquoise water, jungles thick with sound and color. Manila was a cosmopolitan city, elegant and bustling, a place where American military personnel lived well. The Naval Hospital at Canacao sat on a peninsula south of Manila in Cavite Province. It was a proper hospital, clean and well-equipped with real wards and real facilities. The work was routine. The pace was gentle. The evenings were long and warm. Anne later described life there with a kind of wistful simplicity. Life was very good out there. You went to work at 8 o'clock and took lunch and never went back on duty. The American military community in the Philippines was comfortable, perhaps too comfortable. There were dances and dinner parties, swimming and tennis. The war in Europe seemed distant. The tensions with Japan were worrying, but the American fortress in the Philippines and with its naval bases, its airfields, its garrison of soldiers, seemed formidable. The truth, which the officers and planners in Washington knew, and the men and women in the Philippines did not fully appreciate, was that the American position in the Pacific was far more fragile than it appeared. Japan had been building its military for decades. Its army was battle-hardened from years of war in China. Its navy was powerful and growing, and its ambitions extended across the entire Pacific Ocean. While Anne and her colleagues worked their gentle shifts in Canacao and spent their evenings watching the sun set over Manila Bay, the machinery of war was already moving. Nobody in the Philippines could have known that the calendar was counting down. That paradise had an expiration date, that the last ordinary day was already behind them. December 7th, 1941, a Sunday, a day of rest. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The news reached the Philippines hours later, crackling over radio receivers, passed in whispers from officer to officer, nurse to nurse. The United States was at war. The next morning, December 8th, Japanese aircraft appeared in the skies over the Philippines. They came in waves, bombers and fighters, precise and relentless, and they struck the airfields first. Clark Field. Iba Field. The American Air Force in the Philippines, which should have been dispersed and ready, was caught on the ground. In a matter of hours, the American air defenses were effectively destroyed. The Naval Hospital at Canacao, so recently a place of routine and quiet, became a target. Bombs fell on Cavite. The naval yard exploded. Buildings burned. Casualties flooded in. Sailors with shrapnel wounds, pilots with burns, soldiers torn open by blast. Anne and her colleagues worked without stopping, moving patients, managing the operating rooms, doing what nurses do in the middle of catastrophe, staying calm, staying focused, keeping people alive. The hospital had to be evacuated to Manila. Anne was assigned to an emergency operating team working under Army supervision, treating the tide of wounded that was only going to get worse. Manila itself was declared an open city. A desperate legal designation meant to spare it from bombing. It didn't work. The Japanese bombed it anyway. Christmas Eve, 1941. The city was being evacuated. American and Filipino forces were retreating north and west under enormous Japanese pressure. On that morning, Christmas Eve, while families back in Pennsylvania were hanging stockings and wrapping gifts, Anne Bernatitus was given sudden orders. She was going to Bataan. Bataan is a peninsula on the western side of Luzon, the main island of the Philippines. It juts south into Manila Bay like a pointed finger. Dense jungle covers most of it. Mountains run down its spine. In peacetime, it was remote and largely undeveloped. In January 1942, it became the last ground on which American and Filipino soldiers intended to fight. General Douglas MacArthur had ordered his forces to fall. Back to Bataan according to War Plan Orange, a contingency, designed for exactly this situation. The plan called for defenders to hold the peninsula until the United States Navy could fight its way across the Pacific to relieve them. There was only one problem with this plan. There was no Navy coming. Pearl Harbor had seen to that. The men on Bataan knew this at some level as the weeks went by and no relief arrived. They were fighting and dying to defend a position that could not ultimately be held, for a rescue that was not coming. They fought anyway, because that is what soldiers do. Anne arrived at the Army Hospital at Limay, Bataan, and began working immediately. There was no orientation, no settling in, no gentle introduction. There were wounded men everywhere and not nearly enough hands to treat them. On January 25, 1942, she was transferred to Army Field Hospital No. 1 at Little Baguio, deep in the Bataan jungle. She was the only Navy nurse in the entire Bataan area, surrounded by Army personnel working under Army command, completely cut off from the rest of the Navy Nurse Corps. Her colleagues from Canacao were in Manila, where they would soon be captured and imprisoned by the Japanese. Anne was here in the jungle under the bombs. Let me be specific about what the conditions were, because the word difficult does not come close to capturing it. The field hospital was not a hospital in any sense that word implies. It was tents, cots, makeshift operating tables, equipment that had been hauled into the jungle because there was nowhere else to put it. Medical supplies were rationed from the first week and ran out faster than anyone expected. Anesthesia was limited. Antibiotics were limited. Everything was limited. The heat in the Philippine jungle is not the dry heat of a desert that can be endured with water and shade. It is wet, suffocating, all-encompassing. It presses against you like a warm, damp hand. It lives in your clothes and in your lungs. In that heat, wounds infected quickly. Men who might have survived with proper care sickened and died because the conditions made proper care nearly impossible. The disease was relentless. Malaria swept through the defenders. The jungle was full of mosquitoes and there was no avoiding them. Dengue fever hit men with sudden violent fevers. Dysentery, bacterial infection of the intestines, caused severe diarrhea that left men dehydrated and exhausted. Beriberi, caused by thiamine deficiency, attacked the nervous system. Both Anne and many of the soldiers she treated suffered from these conditions while still trying to function. Anne herself contracted dysentery and beriberi. She was working 16-hour shifts, sometimes around the clock, with severe intestinal illness and nerve damage causing pain in her hands and feet. There was no sick leave in Bataan. You worked or you didn't, and the men in the cots needed you, so you worked. And then there were the bombs. The Japanese had control of the air. Their aircraft could fly over Bataan more or less at will, and they used that control to pound the American and Filipino positions relentlessly. They bombed supply depots, ammunition dumps, troop concentrations, and despite the medical markings required by international law, hospitals. Twice during the siege of Bataan, Japanese bombers found and destroyed the surgical unit where Anne worked. Think about what that means. You are in the middle of surgery, or you are in the ward, checking on patients who cannot move, or you are sterilizing instruments or mixing medications, or simply trying to get 15 minutes of sleep on a cot, and then the ground shakes, and the walls, almost such as they are, might collapse, and the tents catch fire, and suddenly you are not treating patients. You are saving them from the wreckage, pulling wounded men through debris, trying to figure out which equipment survived and which is gone and what you will operate with now. And then, once the fires are out and the chaos is managed and the unit has relocated to a new position in the jungle, you go back to work. Because the men keep arriving. Because the wounds don't stop because you had a bad day. Anne worked directly under Lieutenant Commander C.M. Smith, performing surgery on critically wounded men under conditions that would have been considered impossible in any other context. She treated shrapnel wounds, jagged pieces of metal that entered the body in unpredictable ways, piercing organs, shattering bones, embedding in places that required careful, precise extraction. She treated bullet wounds. She treated burns. She treated infected wounds that had been left untreated too long because there was no time, no supply, no way to reach the casualties sooner. She assisted with amputations. Limbs that could not be saved removed to save the man. She treated American soldiers. She treated Filipino soldiers fighting alongside them. She even treated injured Japanese prisoners, because the medical oath does not distinguish between friend and enemy. She did this for 4 months. January became February. February became March. The situation on Bataan was deteriorating in every measurable way. Food supplies, never adequate, ran critically low. The men defending Bataan were on half rations, then quarter rations. They were hunting monkeys and eating the pack animals, horses, mules, whatever could be found, to stay alive. Men who were already sick and exhausted were now also starving. Ammunition was running short. Reinforcements were not coming. MacArthur had been evacuated from Corregidor to Australia in March, under direct orders from President Roosevelt, leaving General Jonathan Wainwright in command of the impossible situation. The Japanese, reinforced and resupplied, launched a major offensive in early April. On April 7, 1942, Japanese bombs found Field Hospital No. 1 again. This time the destruction was complete. The hospital that Anne had helped build and rebuild again was gone. 2 days later, on April 9, 1942, Bataan fell. Major General Edward King, faced with the imminent annihilation of his starving, exhausted, outnumbered force, made the decision that haunted him for the rest of his life. He surrendered. More than 75,000 American and Filipino soldiers laid down their weapons. It was the largest surrender of American forces in the history of the United States military. What followed was the Bataan Death March, 66 miles on foot in tropical heat. Without adequate food or water, under the supervision of Japanese guards who beat, bayoneted, and killed men who fell behind, thousands died on the march. Thousands more died in the prison camps at the end of it. For the survivors, the suffering was only beginning. Anne Bernatitus was not among them. In the days before the surrender, she had been evacuated to Corregidor. Corregidor is a small island, roughly 3.5 miles long and 1.5 miles wide, at the entrance to Manila Bay. The Americans called it the Rock. It had been fortified extensively. Over the decades preceding the war, its tunnels and gun emplacements designed to make it a fortress that could control the bay indefinitely. The crown jewel of Corregidor's defenses was the Malinta Tunnel, massive underground complex carved into the heart of the island. It housed headquarters, storage facilities, and now a hospital. Hundreds of feet of solid rock above your head, a place that bombs couldn't reach, except that the bombardment from Japanese artillery and aircraft never stopped. The ground shook constantly. The air inside the tunnel was thick with dust and smoke that seeped in from the surface. The wounded kept arriving. Anne worked in the hospital inside the Malinta Tunnel, treating casualties in the dim electric light, in the noise, in the heat. Corregidor was holding, but everyone who thought clearly about it knew it would not hold forever. The Japanese controlled everything around the island, the air, the sea. Supplies were running out. Ammunition was running out. It was, as Bataan had been, a matter of time. The question was who would get out before the end came. The USS Spearfish was a Sargo-class submarine that had been operating in the Pacific since the war began. On the night of May 3, 1942, it arrived at Corregidor with a mission: extract a group of personnel whose survival was deemed valuable enough to risk a submarine in Japanese-controlled waters. The passenger list was carefully assembled: 6 Army officers, 6 Navy officers, 11 Army nurses, a civilian, and 2 stowaways who had managed to slip aboard in the chaos, and Anne Bernatitus, the only Navy nurse to be included. The 25 people crowded into a submarine not designed for passengers. There were no private quarters, no comfortable bunks. The space that submariners normally fought over became an open-air shelter for exhausted, malnourished, traumatized evacuees. The Spearfish dove beneath the Japanese patrols and headed south. For 17 days they traveled through hostile waters. During daylight hours, the submarine ran submerged, moving silently through the dark water to avoid Japanese surface ships and aircraft that would have attacked on sight. At night, the submarine surfaced to recharge its batteries, and the passengers could briefly breathe fresh air. 17 days in a submarine, beneath Japanese patrolled waters, after 4 months of siege and bombardment and illness and death. Anne Bernatitus had survived Bataan and Corregidor. She just had to make it to Australia. 3 days after the Spearfish left Corregidor on May 6, 1942, General Wainwright surrendered the island. The last American position in the Philippines was gone. The men and women who had not gotten out were now prisoners of war, including many of Anne's colleagues from Canacao, who would spend the rest of the war in Japanese prison camps under brutal conditions. The Spearfish reached Australia. Anne Bernatitus had escaped. She returned to the United States, promoted to chief nurse. She was thin, still recovering from the dysentery and beriberi that had plagued her through Bataan. She had been at war for 5 months. 5 months that most people could not have endured for 5 days. The country was beginning to understand what had happened in the Philippines. The stories were coming out. The fall of Bataan, the death march, the courage of the men and women who had fought and died or were now imprisoned. The nation needed to honor what had been done there. In October 1942, the United States Congress established the Legion of Merit. It was a new decoration, created specifically to recognize exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services, on a medal for those whose service was extraordinary but did not fit neatly into the existing categories of valor. The first award needed to go to someone whose service was beyond question, someone whose record was unimpeachable, someone who embodied everything. The medal was meant to recognize. They chose Anne Bernatitus. She became the first American, the very first person in the entire United States Naval Service to receive the Legion of Merit. She was also the first person authorized to wear the Combat V device with the award, the small bronze V designating valor in combat. Her citation read, in part, for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services to the government of the United States as a member of Surgical Unit No. 5 during the Japanese attack on the Philippines, December 1941 through April 1942. Constantly in the front lines of the Manila-Bataan area, and on 2 separate occasions forced to evacuate to new positions after Japanese bombs had wrecked the surgical unit, Nurse Bernatitus courageously withstood the dangers and rigors of tropical combat, rendering efficient and devoted service during the tense days of prolonged siege and evacuation. The citation ended with 4 words that say everything about how she conducted herself through all of it. Courage and good spirit. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for relief. She didn't break. She treated her patients, moved when she had to, rebuilt when she had to, and kept going. Courage and good spirit. Anne Bernatitus was not done. From 1942 to 1944, she served as chief nurse at Naval Hospitals in Bethesda, Maryland, New Orleans, Louisiana, Great Lakes, Illinois, and San Francisco, California. She trained nurses. She built programs. She applied everything she had learned in Bataan to the task of preparing others for what war demanded of them. But she wanted to go back. In November 1944, she returned to the Pacific Theater, this time as Chief of Nursing Service aboard the hospital ship USS Relief. A hospital ship is not a combat vessel. It is painted white with red crosses. Its mission purely medical, but the waters it operates in are the same dangerous waters where ships are sunk and men are dying. The Relief deployed to support the Battle of Okinawa. If you know anything about the Pacific War, you know that name. The battle for that island, fought from April through June of 1945, was among the bloodiest of the entire conflict. Nearly 12,000 Americans were killed. Another 38,000 were wounded. Thousands of Japanese soldiers and over 100,000 Okinawan civilians died. Kamikaze attacks, suicide pilots flying their aircraft into American ships, were relentless. The casualties flowed onto the Relief in an unending stream. Burn victims from kamikaze strikes, men torn apart by artillery and mortars, soldiers who had survived the landing only to be caught by Japanese counterattacks. Anne was there, directing the nursing staff, managing the wards, doing what she had always done, keeping people alive. After the war ended, she continued to serve. Naval Hospitals in Rhode Island, Camp Pendleton in California, Philadelphia. She completed advanced coursework in occupational therapy and became Chief of Occupational Therapy at naval facilities in Texas and California. She was promoted to commander in 1950. She retired as a captain in 1959, 23 years of service. From the coal town of Exeter to the jungles of Bataan to the waters off Okinawa. The medals and ribbons that Anne Bernatitus earned in 23 years of service represent a military career of extraordinary range and distinction, the Legion of Merit with Combat, the American Defense Service Medal, the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal with 2 campaign stars, the World War II Victory Medal, the Navy Occupation Service Medal, the China Service Medal, the Philippine Defense Ribbon, the Philippine Liberation Ribbon, the Philippine Independence Ribbon, the Army Distinguished Unit Badge. Each of those decorations represents a place she went, a thing she endured, a contribution she made. Together, they tell the story of a woman who spent 2 decades serving her country in some of the most demanding assignments the Navy could offer, and never asked for anything in return except the chance to do her job. In 1976, she made one final gesture that speaks to her character. She donated her Legion of Merit medal, the very first one ever awarded, her medal, the one she had earned in the jungles of Bataan while sick with dysentery and beriberi, to the Smithsonian Institution. She gave it away. She wanted it to be seen. She wanted people to know what it represented, not her, specifically, but the nurses who had been there, the soldiers who had held on as long as they could, the men who had died on the death march while she escaped on a submarine. She wanted the story to be preserved. The medal is there today in the Smithsonian where anyone can see it. In the Smithsonian where anyone can see it.